Kyle opened his and didn't realize where he was. Under it the floorboards. It smelled like that my stomach squeezed into a fist. He was on something soft and cold. I turned my head and saw a face. Gray, motionless, with open mouth. A corpse. Kyle twitched and hit the back of his head against the side of the cart. Next to lay 3, all dead. All in black spots on neck and arms. He tried sit, but his body wouldn't obey. My hands were weak as after a long illness. Legs feel like cotton. My clothes feels him or someone else's. A coarse shirt made gray canvas, pants tied with a rope. On his, bare feet pressed against corpse. There was a long cobblestone paved, and every stone resonated into spine. They did not turn around. He sat in front and pulled the reins of a horse. On his of was Russian was soaked with dark. Kyle looked around. The city. Narrow streets. Stone houses in 2 stories with wooden extensions. The shutters are closed. The doors nailed shut. On one door is white cross. On other one too. And on next one. Kyle counted 7 white crosses before then the cart turned onto a street. Here there more people. They were along the walls, pressing their faces rags and bundles of herbs. No one didn't look at them. Everyone turned away. One woman held to her a child and almost ran. The man in leather apron stood by the door and was looking at the ground. Kyle tried to speak, but from his came a wheeze. He began to cough. The coachman turned around. His over the rag were tired and indifferent. He said something in language that Kyle couldn't understood. Then he understood. The words sounded like German, but not quite. Something in between. Rough. Archaic. The coachman said that there one had, and that this happens. I said that it's if not, wake up. They'll be here. Kyle asked where. The coachman didn't answer. The wagon stopped at a long building with a roof. From under door came smell from which Kyle bent, and it threw up right onto the floorboards. The coachman swore. The door opened, and a man in a long robe. On face, a mask with a long beak stuffed herbs. Kyle knew this mask. Plague doctor. From a history. From an engraving. Only now was not an engraving. The mask was real. The leather was cracked. Beak packed so full that stuck out dry stems. The eye sockets were with glass. The masked man pointed at Kyle and said something to his assistant. 2 burly men approached the cart and grabbed Kyle by the arms. He tried to break free but had no strength left. They dragged him inside. A barracks. A long room with a dirt floor covered in straw. 40 people, maybe more. They lay on the floor on mattresses on the bare earth, moaning, coughing. Some didn't move. Kyle realized that some were already dead but hadn't been taken away yet. He was thrown into an empty spot between an old man with black spots on his neck and a woman who was crying quietly. Kyle lay there and stared at the ceiling. The beams were covered in black soot. A single torch burned in the corner. The light was dim and flickering. He tried to gather his thoughts. The last thing he remembered? Edinburgh. Friday. End of his shift at the bar. The shawarma place on the corner. The very spot where he always got a double with hot sauce. Then his stomach twisted. Then darkness. Then a cart. It's a dream. It has to be a dream. Kyle pinched his arm. The pain was real. The smell was real. The moans around him were real. He closed his eyes and opened them again. Nothing had changed. The old man next to him wheezed. Kyle turned toward him. The spots on his neck were the size of a fist. Buboes. The plague. Bubonic plague. Kyle knew this from school. The Black Death, the 14th century, killed a third of Europe, spread by fleas and rats, and through the air in its pneumonic form. He was lying in a barrack full of plague victims. No mask, no gloves, barefoot on straw soaked in sweat and blood. Panic washed over him like a wave. Kyle sat up. He looked around. The door was locked. No windows. The only way out was through the door, and there stood a guard. Not for security, to make sure no one got out. Quarantine. Not a real quarantine, though, just a locked-down barracks where everyone dies together. Kyle pressed his shirt to his face and breathed through the fabric. It was almost useless, but it was something. His mind raced. The plague, the bacterium, Yersinia pestis. He remembered that. It's treated with antibiotics, which aren't here. And there wouldn't be any for another 600 years. But, the plague doesn't kill everyone. Some survive. Those with stronger immune systems. And those who get lucky. Kyle looked at his hands. No spots. No buboes. Maybe he wasn't infected yet. Maybe this body still had time. This body. He realized the body wasn't his. His hands were rougher than they used to be. His fingers were shorter, calluses on his palms. Someone else's body. But his head, his thoughts, his memory. 8th grade chemistry. A bartender from Edinburgh. A chemist who never finished school. Dropped out of college in his sophomore year. He had the sense to remember the basics, but not the patience to finish his studies. And now, here he was. Wherever this was. Kyle got to his feet. They trembled but held him up. He approached the guard at the door. The guard recoiled and pointed his spear at Kyle. He shouted for him not to come any closer. Kyle stopped. He raised his hands. He said he needed ash. The guard looked at him as if he were crazy. Kyle repeated himself. Ash. From a stove. From a hearth. Any kind of ash. The guard said he was delusional and told him to go back to where he came from. Kyle didn't leave. He said he could help the sick, that he needed ash and fat. Any fat. Pork, beef, and water. Boiled water. The guard was silent. Then he asked who he was. A healer. Kyle said yes, that he was a healer. It was a lie, but here, lying was the only way to survive. The guard called for someone. A man in a mask came. That very plague doctor. Kyle repeated his request. Ash. Fat. Boiled water. The doctor was silent behind his mask. Then he asked why. Kyle said he would make a remedy that cleanses the hands and skin. That kills the plague. The doctor laughed. The laughter behind the mask sounded hollow and terrifying. He said the plague was in the air and in foul odors, that only bloodletting and prayer could cure it. Kyle stood and looked at him. Then he said one sentence. He said that bloodletting had killed more people than the plague. The doctor fell silent. The guard gripped his spear tighter. Silence hung in the air for a long minute. Then the doctor turned and left. Kyle thought that was the end, that they would simply leave him here to die. But an hour later, the door opened. The guard tossed a sack inside. The sack contained ash. Dirty ash, with bits of coal. But ash. Kyle fell to his knees and untied the sack. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from realization. Ash is lye, potassium lye, potash. If mixed with water, it makes an alkaline solution. If you add fat and heat it, a saponification reaction will begin. Soap. He can make soap, here, now, in the plague barracks, with ash and fat. Kyle looked at the barracks. 40 people, half of them on the verge of death. He had no antibiotics, no sterile instruments, nothing. But he had ash. And he remembered that hand-washing reduces mortality. Ignaz Semmelweis proved this in the 19th century, and his colleagues tore him apart for it, and he died in a mental institution. Kyle smirked. A great role model. He poured the ash onto a rock by the wall and began crushing the large chunks. He needed fine ash. He needed water. He needed fat. He needed fire. He needed time, which he didn't have. But he started anyway. Because the only thing he knew how to do in life was not to give up when things were already bad. Dropped out of college. Didn't give up. Worked at a bar. Didn't give up. Died from a shawarma. And even then, he didn't give up. An old man groaned nearby. Kyle looked at him. Then he looked at the ash in his hands and continued crushing. Fat was there until morning. Kyle spent the night on straw next with the dying. He sleep. I listened, the wheezing. I counted. By morning, the two had fallen silent. They were dragged to the door and covered with rags. The guard was relieved. The new was younger. Kyle approached to him and asked some fat. The guard said that no fat for the plague. Kyle said that he really just a little. Scraps. Scraps. That is thrown away. The guard remained silent. Kyle said that if he get fat, then by tomorrow day they'll 5-5 and they will carry out. The guard turned pale. He was clearly afraid corpses. After 2 hours at the a pot with a piece of lard. Kyle grabbed it with hands. The smell hit my and stomach, and his almost threw up, but he swallowed and held back. We need a fire. In barracks, their hearth, small, a stone niche in the wall with smoldering embers. They was used to warm water for the sick. Kyle tossed in a pinch. He fanned the coals, found some the junk a pot with a chipped rim. This will his cauldron. He put lard in pot and placed on the coals. The fat began melt, slowly. Along the barracks, a three of grease. Someone of patience raised their heads. They decided that they were food. A woman next to asked to eat. Kyle said that it not food. She didn't understand. Until the fat was melting, Kyle was preparing lye. He poured ash into a bowl. He added water. He stirred it with a stick. He let it settle. He needed to strain it. He tore a strip from the hem of his shirt and stretched it over a second pot. He poured the ash water through the cloth. The result was a cloudy solution. Lye. Weak. Dirty. But lye. Now for the most important part. Hot fat and lye solution. Kyle remembered the formula. Fat plus lye when heated equals soap plus glycerin. The saponification reaction. He'd learned that in his freshman year, and forgotten it in his sophomore year, and now it was the only thing standing between him and death. He poured the lye solution into the hot fat. It sizzled. The smell grew sharper. Kyle stirred with a stick, slowly, evenly. The mixture bubbled. He didn't know the exact proportions. The textbook had numbers he didn't remember. He acted on intuition. The fat had to be hot but not boiling. There had to be enough lye to break down the fat. Too much, and the soap would burn the skin. Too little, and the fat wouldn't break down. Kyle stirred and watched the texture change. After half an hour, the mixture began to thicken. It became viscous, murky. He took the pot off the heat, let it cool a bit, tested it with a finger. It stung. So there was a bit too much lye. But it'll do for a first try. He spread the mass onto a stone. It was brown, lumpy. It smelled of burnt fat and ash. It was the ugliest soap in the history of soap making. But it was soap. Kyle reached for the water jug and took a piece. He rubbed it between his palms. Foam. Weak. A bit dirty, but foam. He lathered his hands, rinsed. His skin squeaked. Clean. Kyle stood there, staring at his wet hands. Clean hands in a plague barracks. He wanted to laugh, but instead sat down on the floor and covered his face with his hands. A minute later, he stood up. There was no time. He walked over to the nearest patient, a man in his 40s, buboes on his neck, fever, delirium. Kyle lathered up a rag and wiped his face, his neck, hands. The man flinched, opened his eyes, looked at Kyle with a dazed gaze. Kyle said everything was fine, that he was washing him, that it would help. The man didn't understand but didn't resist. Kyle moved on to the next one, and the next. In 3 hours, he washed 12 people. The soap ran out. His hands were red from the lye. His skin was burning. But he did it. Then he walked over to the door. The guard stepped aside. Kyle told him that everyone entering the barracks had to wash their hands. The guard asked why. Kyle said the infection spreads through dirt, through the hands, through the filth. The guard said the infection was in the air, and that everyone knew it. Kyle shook his head. He said the air had nothing to do with it, that the disease was on the hands and on things. The guard looked at him for a long time. Then he shrugged and turned away. On the second day, Kyle made more soap. He asked for more ash, more fat. The guard brought it, maybe out of pity, maybe out of boredom. Kyle divided the barracks, the left side for those still on their feet, the right for the severely ill. Between them, a strip of straw that he had soaked in an ash solution. A quarantine within a quarantine. Madness. But he saw the logic. Those not yet in the critical stage might pull through if they didn't catch a new dose of bacteria from the dying. He made the walking sick wash their hands before eating. They didn't understand why. One refused. Kyle didn't argue. A day later, that man died. Maybe a coincidence, maybe not. But after that, the rest washed their hands without argument. On the third day, Kyle demanded boiled water. The guard said there was barely enough fire to keep them warm. Kyle said that if they drank raw water from the river, they would die not from the plague, but from a dozen other diseases. The guard didn't understand. Kyle explained it more simply. He said that creatures live in the water that cannot be seen with the naked eye. They are so small that 100 of them would fit on the tip of a needle. They get into your stomach and kill you from the inside. Boiling kills these creatures. The guard crossed himself. Then he said that Kyle was mad. But he boiled the water. By the end of the first week, Kyle summed up the results. Of the 20 people on the left side of the barracks, 4 died. Of the 20 on the right side, 12 died. Those who washed their hands and drank boiled water died 3 times less often. Kyle sat against the wall and drew with a stick on the ground. Numbers. Simple numbers. 4 out of 20. 12 out of 20. This isn't proof in the scientific sense. The sample size is tiny. There are dozens of variables. But for a medieval barracks, these were statistics. And they told a single story. Soap works. Boiling works. Cleanliness works. The only question is whether anyone outside these barracks will listen. The guard noticed the difference. He said they were carrying out bodies less often from the left side. Kyle nodded. He asked the guard to pass this on to his superiors. The guard grimaced. He said the superiors didn't give a damn about the plague barracks. They were just waiting here for everyone to die and then burn the building down. Kyle looked at the people around him, at the old woman boiling the lye solution, at the boy handing out boiled water, at the man cutting soap into pieces and placing them by the beds. They didn't know why it worked. They just did what Kyle told them to do. Because those who did it were still alive, and those who didn't weren't. Kyle gripped the stick in his hand. He had to get out of this barracks. He had to get this message to those who could change the rules, to the one who ruled the city, to the Duke. But first, he had to survive. On the 9th day in barracks, a man without a mask. This was strange because that everyone who entered put on although even rag. This didn't. He was tall, thin, in dark coat with a hood, his pale with deep shadows under her eyes. He stopped at the threshold and looked around the barracks. For a long time looked at the side, then at right, then to the soaked straw between them. The guard stretched out and called him Master Chief. So it was head of the of Nordheim. Kyle stood by hearth and stirred a new batch of soap. The doctor approached to him, introduced himself as Master Richter. He said that the guard told some things. Kyle nodded. Richter asked what he was. Kyle replied briefly. Soap. For washing. Kills germs on the skin. Richter raised an eyebrow. He asked where Kyle know about the infection on skin. Everyone know that the disease in the air, in the miasms, in bad fumes. Kyle thought for a second, then said that miasms not mean. What disease is transmitted from person to person through touch, through dirt, through filth? What mask with herbs is useless? Richter fell silent. His face did not reveal anything. Then he said that it heresy, that medical science is based on the theory of humors and miasms for 1,000 years. What one madman in a barrack cannot erase the works of Hippocrates and Galen. Kyle didn't know who Galen, but knew that the theory of miasms killed millions of people over centuries. He pointed to barracks. He said that on the left, washed our hands and drank boiled water. On the right, no. On the left for a week, 4. On the right, 12. Let Richter explain this with miasms. Richter looked at the left side, then at right. I counted the bodies, faces, the living and motionless. Kyle saw how his eyes. The doctor thought, and numbers did add up with his theory. Richter turned to Kylo. He asked where he went to school. Kyle said that far away, across the sea. Richter nodded. He stood for a minute, then left without saying anything. Kyle looked after him. The boy years 10 came and pulled by his sleeve, thin, big-eyed, clean-shaven, shaved head covered scabs. Kyle saw him before. He was on left side with the day. Tympany on neck broke through and healed. He survived. The boy asked what the man. Kyle said that nothing good. The boy nodded with a serious that looked strange in his face. He introduced himself. Hans. Kyle asked how old he was. Hans said 10 or 11. His mother was dead. His father too. His uncle had dropped him off at the barracks and left. Kyle clenched his jaw. Hans asked if he could help. Kyle looked at him for a long time. Then he gave him a bar of soap and told him to hand it out to those on the left side. Hans grabbed the soap and ran off. On the 12th day, something happened that Kyle hadn't expected. The door opened and 4 guards entered. Behind them was a man in rich clothing, a dark red doublet, fur trim on the collar, gloves made of fine leather. But his face was gray and gaunt, his eyes were red. This man hadn't slept for many nights. A guard whispered that it was the Duke Karl von Braunwald. Kyle froze. The Duke stopped in the middle of the barracks. He didn't hide his face. He didn't turn away from the sick. He looked straight ahead. Then he turned to Kyle. He said he'd been told about the barracks where people had stopped dying, that Master Richter had reported on a madman who treated people with soap. The Duke wanted to see for himself. Kyle stood before him in a dirty shirt, his hands red from lye. He knew this was his only chance. If the Duke didn't believe him, he would remain in the barracks forever. Kyle began to speak. Simple, brief, without terms they wouldn't understand. He said that the disease lives on hands and on objects, that washing kills it, that boiling water kills it, that if you separate the sick from the healthy, the disease spreads more slowly, that the numbers prove it. 4 deaths versus 12 in the 2 identical halves of the barracks. The Duke listened in silence. Then he asked one question. He asked if Kyle could save his daughter. Kyle didn't know the Duke had a daughter, didn't know that 2 had already died, that only 1 remained. Anna, 6 years old. She fell ill 3 days ago. The doctors are powerless. The priests are praying, and the girl is burning up. Kyle asked what her symptoms were. The Duke said, fever, spots, a bubo under her left arm. Kyle closed his eyes. Bubonic form, not pneumonic. That's good. The bubonic form kills 6 out of 10. The pneumonic form kills 9 out of 10. The girl has a chance. A small one, but she has one. Kyle opened his eyes and said he couldn't promise anything, that he had no cure for the plague. No one did. But he could make sure the girl's body fought the disease in a clean environment, without additional filth and infection around her. He could wash the bubo. He could give her boiled water. He could drive away all the doctors who were poking at her with dirty hands and only making things worse. The Duke looked at him. For a long time. The guards exchanged glances. Then the Duke took off his glove and held out his hand. He said that if Kyle saved Anna, he would get whatever he asked for. If not. The Duke didn't finish. He didn't threaten him. He just put his glove back on and turned toward the exit. He told the guards to bring Kyle to the palace. Now. Kyle grabbed the bag of ashes, the pot of soap, the rags. Hans ran up and asked where he was going. Kyle said to the palace. Hans grabbed his shirt, said he'd go with him. A guard shoved the boy away. Kyle turned and told the guard not to touch him. His voice was so firm that the guard took his hand away. Kyle looked at Hans, told him he had to stay. Hand out soap, to make sure everyone washed their hands. That was more important than the palace. Hans stood there with shining eyes. He nodded. Kyle stepped out of the barracks. For the first time in 12 days. The sun hit his eyes so hard he squinted. The air outside wasn't much cleaner. It smelled of smoke. Corpses were being burned outside the city walls. A column of black smoke rose above the walls and spread across the sky. But at least here there was no enclosed space. Kyle took a deep breath. The guards led him through the streets. The city was sick. Closed shops, boarded up doors, white crosses everywhere. Rats scurried along the walls in broad daylight, and no one chased them away. Dogs roamed in packs. One was gnawing on something by the wall. Kyle turned away when he realized what it was. They crossed the market square. Empty. Only the wind blew trash about. The fountain in the center was overgrown with green slime. People drank water from it. Kyle made a mental note of this. The fountain needs to be shut off. They entered the palace through a side gate. The corridors were stone, cold, torches every 10 paces, the scent of lavender and mint from braziers filled with herbs, an attempt to mask the smell of death with fragrances, a futile attempt. Kyle was led into a room on the 2nd floor, a large 4-poster bed, candles, braziers with coals, and on the bed a small figure. Anna, 6 years old, white hair scattered across the pillow, her face red from the heat, her lips chapped. A maid sat nearby, dabbing her forehead with a wet rag. The rag was dirty. The water in the basin was murky. Kyle walked over and took the rag. The maid gasped. Kyle told her to bring clean water, boiled water, and clean rags. Boiled. The maid ran off. Kyle examined the girl. A boil under her left arm, the size of a chicken egg. Red. Tense. It would burst on its own in a day or two. If it burst and drained, she might survive. If not, it would poison her blood and she would die. Kyle took out some soap. He lathered his hands. He washed them over the bowl. Then he rubbed soap onto the girl's skin around the boil. Gently. Anna groaned. Her eyes were half open, cloudy. She didn't understand what was happening. Kyle told her quietly that everything would be all right. It wasn't a lie. It was a promise he didn't know if he could keep. 3 nights Kyle didn't sleep. He sat by Anna's. I was the compresses, wiped her skin with soapy solution. I gave boiled water with honey. Every hour he checked the tambourine. He waited. The Duke came twice a day. He stood at the doorway and watched. He say a word, just looked at his daughter, at Kayla, at soap in his hands, and he walked away. Doctors came too. Master Richter sent 2. They wanted to let the girl to bleed. Kyle stood between them and the bed. He said that if they touch the child with their dirty lancets, he will keep them out the window. The doctors were outraged. They said that Kyle does not has the right. What he does foreman of the uses that he does license. Kyle replied that license didn't help them save their eldest daughters. They left. But Kyle knew that it wasn't the end. On the night the Used began change color, from red to crimson, then purple. The skin tightened. Anna moaned and thrashed about. The heat rose. Kyle held her by hand. Her black was so small that fit in his palm entirely. On the third night, the bubo burst open. Pus gushed out, thick, greenish. The smell was unbearable. Kyle worked quickly. He dried the wound with water. I washed with soap the skin all around. I applied a clean bandage, soaked ash solution. After an hour, the heat began to subside, slowly, but noticeably. By morning, Anna opened her eyes, aware. She looked at Kayla. I asked who he. Kyle said that friend. Anna asked where her father was. Kyle called the maid. She ran after the Duke. Carl burst into the room. He saw his buildings with wide eyes. I collapsed to my way by the bed. Kyle stepped toward the wall. He stood and watched as the Duke wept, holding his daughter's small hand. He didn't interfere. He stepped out into the hallway. He leaned against the wall. His legs wouldn't hold him up. 3 nights without sleep. His muscles trembled. His head was spinning. But Anna was alive. A bar of brown, smelly soap and boiled water had done what 10 masked doctors couldn't. An hour later, the Duke stepped out into the hallway. His eyes were red, but his back was straight. He looked at Kyle. He said he'd promised to give him anything he asked for. Kyle asked for a workshop, a room with a stove and a supply of ash and fat, a place where he could make soap, lots of soap, not just 1 bar, but hundreds. The Duke asked why he needed so much. Kyle said the city was dying. 8,000 out of 12,000 were already dead or dying. Soap works. He'd proven it in the barracks and he'd proven it here. If every resident washes their hands, the mortality rate will drop. Not to 0. He doesn't have that kind of magic. But it will drop significantly. Dozens of people. Hundreds. Maybe more. The Duke was silent. Then he asked what else was needed. Kyle took out a stick he'd picked up in the hallway and began drawing on the stone floor. 3 things. First, a soap factory. We need fat. Lots of fat. All the waste from the city's slaughterhouses and kitchens. Ash. Every furnace, every hearth must provide ash. Second, a water boiling station. Large cauldrons in the square, so people can come and draw clean water. Prohibit drinking from the river and the fountain. Third, quarantine. A real one. Not a barracks where everyone is left to die, but segregation. The sick separate. The healthy separate. Those who've been in contact with them separate. 3 zones. And between them, guards who make sure no one crosses over without washing their hands. The Duke listened. His face was expressionless. Kyle thought he'd gone too far, that he'd asked for too much, that the Duke would now say that a single bar of soap didn't give him the right to reorganize the city. But the Duke said 1 word. He said, "Good." And he called for his advisor. The advisor wrote down everything Kyle said. The quill scratched across the paper. 2 hours later, Kyle was standing in a former stable in the palace's backyards. A large room with a stone floor, 2 hearths, a supply of firewood, and the first cartload of ashes that had rolled through the gate. Kyle rolled up his sleeves. A woman stood by the door, large, broad-shouldered, her hands red and cracked. A laundress. She said the Duke had sent her to help. She introduced herself as Martha. She asked what needed to be done. Kyle explained. Ash and water, strain it, fat into the cauldron, melt it, mix it, stir it. An hour, 2, until it thickens. Martha didn't ask questions. She just did it. Half an hour later, Kyle realized she was working faster and more precisely than he was. A laundress's hands are used to lie, to hot water, to hard work. Kyle was mixing 1 batch. Martha had already finished 2. By the end of the first day, they had made 30 bars of soap. Brown. Ugly. But functional. Kyle laid them out on a board and looked at them. 30 bars. In the barracks, he'd make 3 a day. 30 in a single evening. This was a start. The next day, Martha brought 2 friends. Laundresses, too. Kyle explained the process all over again. They nodded and got to work. They didn't argue. They didn't ask why. Martha had apparently already explained. Kyle began experimenting with the proportions. More fat made the soap softer, but it lathered worse. More lye made it lather better, but it burned his hands. He was looking for a balance. He tried. He made mistakes. Twice the batch turned out unusable. It crumbled in his hands. Once the lye was so caustic, it burned Martha's palm. Kyle bandaged her hand. He apologized. Martha looked at him, smiled, and said her hands hadn't felt pain in a long time. She said that if the soap saved even one child, she didn't care about her fingers. Kyle remembered those words. By the end of the week, the soap factory was producing 200 bars a day. The stable smelled of fat and ash. 3 laundresses worked in shifts. Kyle set up the drying area. The soap dried on racks that a carpenter had knocked together for 2 silver coins. The Duke issued his first decree. All palace staff were required to wash their hands before meals and after using the restroom. Soap was provided free of charge. The courtiers were in shock. One baron said that washing one's hands was a custom of beggars and that it was humiliating for a nobleman. The Duke looked at him and asked how many children the baron had. 3, replied the baron. The Duke said that he had had 3 daughters. Only one remained. She was the only one left because one man with a bar of soap had done what all the doctors in the duchy had failed to do. The Duke said the baron did not have to wash his hands. That was his right. But then he should not come to court. The baron washed his hands, but news of the soap spread beyond the palace walls, and not everyone was pleased. Master Richter came to Kyle at the soap factory, without any doctors, alone. He stood and looked at the cauldrons, at the shelves, at the soap. He said calmly that Kyle was practicing medicine without a guild license, that it was a violation of the law, that there was a punishment for it. Richter fell silent. Then he said the punishment for this was banishment from the city, or worse. Kyle was stirring another batch and didn't turn around. He asked how many people the guild had saved this year. Richter didn't answer. Kyle gave a number. 0. The guild hadn't saved a single person, because bloodletting doesn't cure the plague. Aromatic herbs don't cure the plague. Prayers over the sick don't cure the plague. Soap cures it. Not the plague directly, but it kills what spreads it. Richter stood in silence. Then he said that this wasn't the end, and he left. Kyle knew he was right. This isn't the end. This is the beginning. Kyle didn't wait in the church. The church came on its own. On 3rd week after that, the soap factory started at full capacity. In the middle walked a man into white robe. Not very tall, young, in his 20s, shaved on the crown, eyes are attentive. He stood at the threshold and looked as Martha strained the alkaline solution through a cloth. Kyle approached. He asked what he can. The monk introduced himself. Brother Sebastian, from the Delector of the Flame, said that the abbot had sent him to check what the soap heretic. Kyle smiled. Heretic. They found the word. Sebastian raised his hand. He said that the abbot had sent him, but he came by different reason. He came because that in plague barracks at the monastery 20 people in a week, and in barracks where Kyle 4 people. Sebastian said that a monk should close his to a miracle, and asked if Kyle show him how to soap. Kyle was watching at him and tried to understand a trap this or not. Monk from the church which believes the washing the body a sin asks to teach him how soap. This could a provocation. Sebastian apparently read this on his face. He said that if God created ash and fat, then can he wanted for people do from them something useful? Maybe soap that a gift. Just bread made grain, like wine from grapes. Kyle remained silent, then walked to the boiler and called Sebastian. He pointed the process. Ash, water, alkali, fat, heating, reaction, molding, drying. Sebastian was watching without taking his eyes off it, and then took from under his a rolled-up parchment and a quill, and began write. Everything, every step, every proportion. Kyle asked why he was writing it down. Sebastian replied simply. He said that recipes are important, that if with Kyle something happened, knowing not should be lost. Kyle did find what say. No one had ever thought before that knowledge needed to be preserved. Everyone thought only of today, of survival. But this monk thought of the future. By the end of the 4th week, the soap factory was running at full capacity, 200 bars a day. Martha was in charge of 5 laundresses. Kyle had devised a distribution system. The soap went in 3 directions, a third to the palace and the barracks, a third to the plague barracks, a third to the poor quarters. In the poor quarters, Hans distributed the soap. The Duke had released him from the barracks at Kyle's request. The boy was healthy. He'd gotten over his illness and survived. Now he carried a sack of soap through the narrow streets of the southern quarter and handed out 1 bar per family. Kyle had explained to him what to say. Wash your hands before eating. Wash your hands after using the toilet. Wash your face. Don't drink raw water. Hans memorized it and repeated it like a prayer. Every day, house after house. Some took the soap and nodded. Some sniffed it and asked if it was food. One guard sniffed a bar and took a bite. Spit it out. Hans laughed until he cried. But there were also those who refused. A woman with 5 children slammed the door and shouted that soap was unclean. That Father Moritz had said washing the body was a sin. That dirt protects against demons. Kyle heard this from Hans and clenched his fists. Father Moritz, the parish priest of the southern district. He preached that the plague was sent for sins and that prayer was the only salvation. That washing the body was vanity of the flesh. That whoever washed themselves placed their body above their soul. Kyle went to him. He found the church, a small one, made of stone, with a crooked cross. Father Moritz stood at the altar and spoke with the parishioners. There were about 10 of them, all pale, all frightened. Moritz was old, over 60, a beard down to his waist, eyes like a hawk's. Kyle entered and Moritz fell silent. He looked at him, asked who he was. Kyle said he was a soap maker, that the people in the southern quarter were refusing to take soap because Moritz had told them that washing was a sin. That children were dying because their mothers were afraid to wash their hands. Moritz replied that the plague was God's scourge, that God sends disease to purify the sinful, that fighting the plague meant fighting God's will. Kyle stood and listened. The parishioners looked at him. He could have argued, could have shouted, could have explained about bacteria and hygiene. But he stood before an old man who believed every word he said, and before people who believed the old man. Kyle said one thing. He asked how many children in Moritz's parish had died in the last month. Moritz fell silent. Kyle repeated the question. Moritz said quietly that 17. Kyle nodded. He said that in the barracks where they washed their hands, 16 out of 20 children had survived. And in the barracks where they didn't wash, 8 had survived. He asked Moritz if he wanted to lose another 17 next month. Moritz was silent. Kyle placed a bar of soap on the altar. He turned and left. Behind him was silence. He didn't know if it would work, but he did what he could. By the end of the 5th week, the first results were visible to the naked eye. In the poor neighborhoods where soap was actively distributed, the weekly mortality rate dropped from 30 to 14, by half. Kyle recorded the numbers every day, with charcoal on a board in the soap factory. The left column showed the neighborhoods where people washed. The right column showed where they didn't. The difference was obvious. The Duke came and looked at the board. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and looked at the numbers. Anna was getting better. The boil had healed. The fever was gone. She was eating, playing, laughing. The Duke brought her to the soap factory to show her to Kyle. The girl looked at him and said he smelled like grease. Martha laughed. Kyle blushed. Anna walked over to the cauldron and peered inside. She asked what it was. Kyle said it was soap. Anna asked if she could help stir it. The Duke wanted to object, but Kyle handed the girl a stick. She stirred with a serious expression. 2 circles. 3. Then she said she was tired and went to her father. Martha watched this and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. But not everyone was happy. Through the merchants, Kyle learned that the Guild of Physicians had lost half its income. People had stopped paying for doctor's visits. Why pay a doctor silver when a bar of free soap does more than all their herbs and lancets? Master Richter was losing money. And patience. In the 6th week, something happened that Kyle didn't know about until the very last moment. Hans ran into the soap factory that evening, covered in dust, out of breath. He said he'd seen a man. The man was standing by the back entrance, talking to the kitchen boy, paying him. Hans crept closer and listened. The man was asking when Kyle would be leaving the soap factory, what time, whether he'd be alone, which way he'd go. Kyle listened and felt a chill run down his spine. They wanted to kill him, the guild, or the church, or someone else for whom soap was getting in the way of profiting from death. He looked at Hans. The boy stood there, pale but not afraid. He'd seen enough death not to be afraid of threats. Kyle told him to go to the Duke, to tell him everything. Hans nodded and ran off. Kyle stayed in the soap factory, locked the door, sat down on a bench, looked at his hands, red from lye, chapped. A soapmaker's hands, hands that someone wants to stop. He clenched them into fists. They won't stop me. He survived the shawarma, survived the plague barracks, survived 3 nights by the bed of a dying girl. Some mercenary with a knife won't stop him. Kyle stood up, walked over to the cauldron, and began to cook the next batch. The mercenary was that same that Hans ran to the palace and told everything to the door of the guard. The captain put 4 men around the soap factory. The mercenary came after midnight, quiet, in black, with a knife behind his belt. The guard stepped from the darkness and wrestled him before then he'd draw his weapon. In the morning, they brought to the Duke. Kyle stood by the wall and watched. The mercenary was small, slim. His eyes darted about. Under interrogation, he said that had hired him someone through an intermediary. Name is... We met at tavern at the port. They was paid 5 silver coins. 5 silver for a life a person. Kyle thought that it had insulting insufficient. The Duke asked who the client was. The mercenary didn't know. Or said that didn't know. The Duke did try look into long. He ordered to hang in the square, in public, so that everyone can see. Kyle wanted object but remained silent. That wasn't his world. Here is Edinburgh. Here is a duchy, the Middle Ages, and the Duke decides who lives and who doesn't. They hanged at noon. A crowd had get. The city was too sick for entertainment. But those who came heard that the herald, a man tried to kill the soapmaker in the court, the very day who does the day for the plague. The Duke punishes. Kyle stood in the crowd and felt like a stranger. Standing stood Hans. He looked at Gallows without blinking. Kyle placed his on shoulder and turned him. He said that it need look. Hans said that had seen how they die. Kyle nodded, but it still took him away. After the Duke summoned Kayla. They stood together in the office, the large room, cards on the walls, oak table. The Duke said that the assassination attempt was the end, that enemies Kayla will try again. What does needs security? Kyle said that he didn't need security. He needs so soap become ordinary, so it stopped being something strange and dangerous. To everyone in the city washes there didn't, because that the Duke ordered, but because that was. Then no one not make point to kill him. That's that soap will be without it. The Duke looked at him, then asked what for this be needed. Kyle said that we need expand production. 1 soap factory in the stable is not enough. We need 3. In different parts of the city. We need trained people, 10 people, 20, who will boil soap themselves, and need to side the Duke with the church. For now the priests say that washing is a sin. Half the city will afraid soap than the plague. The Duke nodded. He said that with the church is of all. Archbishop Ferdinand is a fool. He knows that soap works. That's is afraid. Kyle didn't understand. The Duke explained, if the illness can be cured with soap and water, why do pray? Why carry money to the church? Why listen priests? Soap threatens not the body, the church, but its meaning. If God is needed for healing, that is needed or at all. Kyle understood. That was more serious than he thought. He didn't nod against ignorance. He fought against a system that for centuries held on fear of death, and then he offered a way not die. Without God, without prayer, with a bar soap. Kyle spent the rest in soap factory, I thought, stirring soap and thought. By evening, Martha, she said that in the news. 3 ships from Grainhofen arrived this morning. The sailors disembarked ashore. Some are coughing. Kyle felt a chill. Grainhaven, the neighboring port. If you came sick, it means the plague is spreading, or has already spread. Nordheim isn't the only city. The plague is spreading along the entire coast. But something in Martha's words caught his attention. 3 ships. Sailors have come ashore. They're coughing. If Nordheim is already under quarantine, why did the ships enter the port? Kyle went to see the Duke. He asked about the port. The Duke frowned. He said the port was technically closed. But the Merchants' Guild has the right to trade. They pay duties. The city needs money. Kyle said the city needs living people. That every ship from an infected port brings new sick people. That they could make soap until the end of time, but if fresh plague comes in through the port every week, it's useless. Like bailing water out of a boat with a hole in the bottom. The Duke said that closing the port would ruin the city. The merchants would revolt. The treasury would run dry. There would be no money to pay the guards. Kyle proposed a compromise. Don't close the port completely, but every ship must be inspected. Sailors must wash their hands before going ashore. The sick are not allowed in. Goods are treated with vinegar. A 3-day quarantine zone in the port, the Duke thought, for a long time. Then he agreed. But he said the merchants would be unhappy, and that the leader among them, Gustav Müller, was a man it was best not to cross. Kyle remembered the name, Müller. The next day, the quarantine rules at the port went into effect. 2 guards on the pier, a barrel of soapy water. Everyone who disembarked washed their hands. The ship captains cursed. One called it madness. Another spat into the barrel. A guard struck him in the face. Kyle watched this from the pier and realized that you can't impose cleanliness by force. People have to want it themselves, but until they do, you have to make them. By the end of the 7th week, Kyle opened a second soap factory, in the southern quarter, in an abandoned house that used to belong to a tanner. The place stank of old hides, but the hearth was good and large. Martha sent 2 trained laundresses there. Hans became the messenger. He ran back and forth between the soap factories with errands. Soap was flowing into the city in a steady stream. 300 bars a day. Kyle dreamed of 500. Sebastian came every day. He took notes. He asked questions. Smart questions. He asked why lye breaks down fat. Kyle explained as best he could. Molecules. Chemical bonds. Sebastian didn't understand the words, but grasped the gist. Once he asked if it was possible to make the soap better, cleaner, odorless. Kyle said it was possible. If you use pure fat, olive oil, for example, and purer lye. Sebastian wrote it down. The next day he brought a bottle of olive oil from the monastery. Kyle made a batch. The soap turned out light, almost white. It lathered well. It had almost no smell. Kyle held it in his hands and thought that in the 21st century they wouldn't have given a pound for something like this. But here, it was a miracle. Sebastian took a piece and carried it back to the monastery. He showed it to the abbot. The abbot sniffed it. He touched it. Then he washed his hands. He didn't say anything, but he didn't forbid it either. A small victory. But for every small victory, there was a blow. In the 8th week, Kyle learned that the Guild of Physicians had filed a complaint with the magistrate, that an unlicensed physician was practicing, that he was distracting the townspeople from proper treatment, that soap was not a recognized remedy, that his methods were not approved by either the guild or the church. The magistrate consisted of 5 people. 3 were loyal to the Duke. 2 were not. The complaint was rejected by a vote of 3 to 2. But the very fact that it existed spoke volumes. Richter would not stop. He would keep the pressure on, wait for the right moment, look for a weak spot. Kyle worked. He made soap. He taught people. He recorded numbers. Every day. The mortality rate in Nordheim during the 8th week was 40% lower than in the first. 40%. That meant hundreds of people who were supposed to die were still alive. Kyle looked at the numbers written in charcoal on the board and felt no joy, only exhaustion, and the realization that there was still a long way to go. In the evening, he sat by the hearth in the soap factory. Martha had left. The laundresses had left. Only Hans was sleeping in the corner on a sack of ash. He didn't want to leave. There was nowhere to go. Kyle stared at the fire and thought of home, of Edinburgh, of the bar, of the mugs he polished every shift, polished with a rag they washed once a week. He smirked. Even back there, he didn't wash his hands as often as he did here. Hans turned in his sleep, mumbled something. Kyle covered him with his cloak, then sat back down, took out some charcoal and began drawing on the wall. A diagram. Plumbing, pipes, drains, sewers. Nordheim dumped sewage straight into the river, the very same river from which they drank water. A vicious cycle. Disease and filth, filth and disease. Soap solved half the problem. Clean hands, clean skin. But the water remained poisoned. The air above the river hung heavy. We need a sewer system, separate drains, so that sewage doesn't get into the drinking water. Kyle sketched and realized this was a project that would take months. Stone, laborers, money, permits. But without that, everything else is just a half measure. Washing your hands and drinking dirty water is like locking the door and leaving the window open. He finished the diagram and stepped back. He looked at it. Rough. Inaccurate. He wasn't an engineer. But the idea was clear. He'd show it to the Duke tomorrow. Tonight, sleep. Kyle lay down on the bench. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 2 months, he fell asleep without nightmares. The widow Kriegel. Kyle found by chance. More precisely, she found it. He was standing in Market Square by the boiler house. Large copper kettle on brick pedestal. The fire under it burned from morning until evening. The townspeople came with buckets and jugs and boiled water and left. For free. The Duke paid for the firewood. The guard kept an eye to no one didn't got dirty hands into the pot. Kyle was checking the boiler every day. He looked to make sure the water was as it should. Don't just, but boiling. Only like this it'd have to that in her lives. The woman walked up from the side, not very tall, in her 50. Her face is wrinkles, hands are dry, eyes are intelligent and sad. She stood and looked at the boiler. Then she said that she had seen something before. Kyle turned around. He asked where. The woman said that 20 years ago she washed her with wine. She was a healer. I treated the wounded mercenaries after the siege Feldmark. Wounds which she washed with wine healed more cleanly, without pus, no fever. She told about this to the guild. The guild said that the wine is his recognized remedy. What wound is treated by bloodletting and poultices made herbs? What a woman not teach men. She was her license. With that time it washes laundry. Kyle listened and felt the blood pounding in temples. This woman 20 years ago began disinfection, all by herself, without textbooks, no theory, just saw that wine heals wounds. And they was for that. He asked how her name Erica Kriegel, a widow. Her died of the plague 3 weeks ago. Kyle said that he needed her help, that she was right 20 years ago. What wine kills germs in wounds just as soap kills germs on hands? What if distill wine is obtain a liquid that kills even better? Erica was watching at him for a long time, then asked what it overtake. Kyle explained. Wine is heated, the is collected. The steam cools and drips into a vessel. The result is a stronger than wine, much stronger. It burns if you bring a flame. This liquid destroys germs. It can to wounds, tools, hands before work with the patient. Erica listened and nodded. Next the day she stood in soap factory. Kyle put together the simplest distillation still. Copper boiler, copper tube coiled into a spiral, the second vessel for collection, filled cheap wine. I lit a fire. After 2 hours in the vessel was a potion with a pungent smell. Kyle brought a pinch to the liquid and struck with flint. A blue flame. Erica flinched. Then she stepped closer. She took a drop onto her finger. She sniffed it, rubbed it between her fingers. The skin dried up immediately. She said it was like wine, but stronger. Kyle nodded. He said that was the essence of wine, purified, concentrated. Erica took the first portion and went to the wounded guard, whose abscess the healer had lanced, leaving the wound open. The wound had been festering for 3 days. Erica washed it with the distillate. The guard screamed in pain, but by the 2nd day, the pus was gone. On the 3rd day, the wound began to heal. The guard came to the soap factory in person. He said the widow had performed witchcraft. Kyle said it wasn't witchcraft but chemistry. The guard didn't understand the word but shook Kyle's hand. Erica became their 5th ally. Sebastian wrote down the recipe for the distillate with such zeal that he wore out 3 quills. Kyle dictated it to him, and Erica corrected him. She said that the wound needed to be washed not once, but 3 times. That first, the dirt had to be removed. Then it had to be washed with the distillate. Then a clean bandage had to be applied. Soaked in the distillate. Change it every day. Kyle listened and realized that Erica knew more than she thought she did. She had been observing wounds for 20 years. She had seen what worked and what didn't. She lacked theory, words, explanations, but her practice was flawless. By the 10th week in Nordheim, the system was up and running. 3 soap factories, a boiling house in the square, a distillation workshop in the soap factory's basement, quarantine rules at the port. Soap was distributed for free in the poor neighborhoods. Boiled water was available to everyone. Erica treated the wounded and sick with open wounds using the distillate. The plague mortality rate in the city had fallen by 60% compared to the first few weeks. Kyle recorded the figures. Sebastian copied them onto parchment. These were not just numbers. They were proof. Every figure represented a person who had not died. A child who woke up in the morning. A mother who was not crying. But the city was still dying. More slowly, but it was dying. Because the plague was already inside the walls, in the rats, in the fleas, in the filth that had accumulated over centuries. Soap and boiling slowed it down. They didn't stop it. Kyle knew that to stop it completely, the sewer problem had to be solved. Sewage in the river, rats in the drains, fleas on the rats. A vicious cycle. He showed the Duke a diagram of the sewer system. The Duke looked at it and asked how much it would cost. Kyle didn't know exactly. A lot. Stone. Laborers. Months of work. The Duke said the treasury was empty. The port was operating at half capacity due to quarantine regulations. Merchants were paying lower duties. Maintaining the guard was eating up what was left. No money for a sewer system. Kyle suggested another way. Not stone pipes all over the city. That could come later. For now, just divert the sewage away from the river. Dig out septic tanks behind the wall. Pits, deep ones, with lime. Send the sewage there, not into the river. It's cheaper. Not ideal, but better than now. The Duke agreed. He assigned 10 workers, former masons who had nothing to do because construction in the plague-stricken city had stopped. Kyle supervised the work. He drew up a plan, showed where to dig. The masons listened to him with skepticism. Who is this soap maker teaching them to dig pits? But the Duke's order is the Duke's order. They dug. Martha came in the evening and said she had news. Bad news. A merchant caravan from Greinhofen had arrived at the port, by land, through the south gate. There were 2 guards at the south gate. The caravan consisted of 12 carts. The merchant presented his papers. Everything was in order. The guards let them through. No one checked. No one made them wash their hands, because the rules only applied at the port. At the land gates, no one had heard of them. Kyle cursed, for the first time in 2 months, in Russian. Marta didn't understand the words but caught the tone. The caravan had already unloaded at the market. The goods had been distributed among the stalls. If any of the caravan members were sick, the contagion was already in the city. A fresh batch. Kyle ran to the Duke. It was late. The Duke was already asleep. Kyle woke him through his valet. The Duke came out in his robe. His face was sleepy, angry. Kyle told him about the caravan. The Duke fell silent. Then he cursed under his breath. No translation was needed to understand what he meant. A new decree was issued that morning. Quarantine rules apply to all city gates. Everyone entering must wash their hands. All goods are inspected. The sick are not allowed in. No exceptions. The merchants found out by noon. Gustav Mueller came to see the Duke in person. Kyle saw him for the first time. He was a large man, red-faced, a gold chain around his neck, rings on every finger. Mueller spoke loudly. He said the quarantine was killing trade, that goods were rotting in the port, that neighboring cities were intercepting the caravans, that Nordheim was losing its position as the coast's main port, that if this continued, it wouldn't be the plague that would kill the city, but starvation. The Duke listened. Kyle stood in the corner. Mueller turned to him, asked who this ragged fellow was. The Duke replied that he was the man who had saved his daughter. Mueller snorted. He said that one daughter wasn't worth an entire port. The silence that followed those words was like a blow. The Duke stood up, slowly. His face turned white. He didn't raise his voice. He said that Mueller could trade under the new rules, or not trade at all, and that if he ever said anything like that about his daughter again, he would have nothing left to trade. Mueller turned pale. He bowed. He left. But Kyle saw his eyes as he walked out. There was no fear in them, only calculation. Mueller hadn't given in. He'd simply retreated. For now. At 12th week, Kyle felt that something was changing. Not in the numbers, in the air, in faces. In Market Square appeared. There many, 5 or 6 stalls. But they stood and sold. Turnips, bread, eggs. People came and bought. Careful. But they came over. Kyle stood by the kettle and watched. The woman with a basket approached to the maw with bread. She reached her hand. She stopped. I turned toward the water heater. She walked over, washed my hands with soap. I went back to the sink. I took the bread. Kyle was at it and couldn't take his eyes. She did it herself, without guard, without order, just habit. A new habit that 2 months ago existed. It stood and looked as 4 out 10 shoppers washed there before doing as approached the bins. 4 out 10. 2 months ago, 0 of 10. A small revolution in Market Square in Nordheim. Anna had recovered. She ran around the palace. She laughed. Every day I would pop into soap shop and stirred the soap with a stick. Martha stirred her a small piece, and Anna ran away with him just with treasure. The Duke looked at his, and at his face something like a smile. Rare. A phrase for a man who had buried 2 children in a single year. In the 13th week, Kyle opened his 3rd soap factory, in the Dockside district. The filthiest place in town. Rats the size of cats, sewage ditches running along the streets, a stench that made your eyes water. The soap factory was housed in a former warehouse. Martha put her best apprentice, Greta, to work there. Kyle trained 4 women from the docks, fishermen's wives, rough hands, accustomed to hard labor. They picked up the process quickly. Within 3 days, they were making soap on their own without supervision. 500 bars of soap a day from the 3 soap factories. Kyle did the math. Nordheim's population is now about 8,000. If each family of 4 uses 1 bar a week, that's 2,000 bars a week, 300 a day. He was making 500, with a surplus. The surplus was for replacements. The soap got soggy. It got lost. Kids played with it and dropped it in the mud. But the main thing was that it was there, accessible, free, on every corner. Hans became famous in town. Everyone knew the boy, the soap boy. He carried soap in a bag and handed it out, knocked on doors, explained, showed how to wash hands properly. 20 strokes, between the fingers, under the nails. Kyle had taught him, and Hans repeated it hundreds of times a day. Some children began to repeat after him. They gathered in groups and washed their hands together at the public barrels that Kyle had placed throughout the neighborhoods. Barrels of soapy water. A simple idea. A wooden barrel, water, bars of soap, a dipper. He placed them at the market entrance, at the gates, by the wells. At first, the townspeople gave them a wide berth. Then they got used to them. Then they started coming over on their own. Sebastian brought news from the monastery. The abbot had allowed the monks to use soap, not in public, not as an endorsement, as a permissible practice. Soap is not a sin if it is not connected to the vanity of the flesh. Soap for clean hands is hygiene, not body adornment. A subtle difference. But for the church, subtle differences are everything. Sebastian said the abbot is a smart man. He sees the numbers. He sees that monks who wash their hands get sick less often. He can't deny the obvious. But he can't speak out openly either, because Archbishop Ferdinand is against it. And the abbot answers to the archbishop. Kyle nodded. Every small step, every monk with clean hands, every child who washed their hands before dinner, it all added up. Drop by drop, slowly, but surely. In the 14th week, something happened that kept Kyle awake for 3 nights. Erica came in the morning. Her face was ashen. She said there was a new outbreak in the Port District. 12 cases in 2 days. All in a row of houses by the Eastern Pier. Kyle ran over there. He inspected the houses. He talked to people. He figured out what all 12 had in common. They had all bought fish from the same merchant. The merchant had come with a caravan from Grainhofen. He passed through the gates under the new rules. He washed his hands. They checked him. He was healthy. But they didn't check his goods. Fish in barrels. Salted. Salted with dirty hands in Grainhofen. Bacteria in the salt. Bacteria on the fish. Kyle punched the wall. He hadn't thought about the goods. He'd been checking people, but the infection was carried by the goods. Barrels, cloth, food, grain. Everything brought in from infected cities could be a carrier. He returned to the Duke. He said the quarantine needed to be tightened. All goods must be inspected. Barrels must be opened and checked. Fabrics must be left in the sun for 3 days. Food from infected cities must be burned. The Duke looked at him with a long gaze. He said that Kyle understood what this meant. Trade would come to a halt. Mueller and his merchants would revolt. The city wouldn't survive without trade. People would start starving. And then it wouldn't be the plague that killed them, but hunger. Kyle knew. He understood. But 12 cases in a single neighborhood in 2 days was no small matter. It was the start of a new wave, one that would devour everything they'd built over 3 months. The Duke thought about it all day. Kyle waited. In the evening, the answer came. A compromise. Goods from Grainhaven and other infected ports would be treated with vinegar. Salted fish would be burned. Grain would be dried over a fire. Fabrics would be left out in the sun. Everything else would be inspected by doctors. Not the guilds. Erica's. The Duke appointed Kriegel's widow as the port health inspector. Richter found out and came to the palace. He shouted that this was an insult to the guild, that a woman without a license had been appointed over the heads of the masters. The Duke replied that the masters hadn't saved a single person in a year, while this woman had healed 30 wounds in a month that had festered after being treated by the masters. Richter stormed out, slamming the door. Kyle stood in the hallway. He heard everything. He realized that Richter was now a personal enemy, not just an opponent, an enemy. A man who had been humiliated in front of the Duke, who had been told to his face that he was useless. People like that don't forgive. By the end of the 4th month, Kyle took stock of the situation. The plague mortality rate in Nordheim had dropped to 1/3 of its peak. 8,000 residents. Of those, about 5,500 were healthy. 1,500 were sick to varying degrees. 1,000 had died over the past 4 months. Without soap and boiling water, 3,000 or 4,000 would have died. Kyle looked at the numbers and thought that 2,000 people were alive, because he remembered his 8th grade chemistry. 2,000. Alive. He didn't know their names, he didn't know their faces, but they were breathing, eating, sleeping, waking up in the morning, because a bar of brown, smelly soap worked. On 5th month, Kyle found rats. More precisely realized that without them nothing would end. The soap worked. Boiling worked. Quarantine worked. But the rats were everywhere. Thousands. Tens thousands. They lived in basements, in walls, in sewer drains, in grain silos, in each rat, on every flea carry. Kyle could wash every hand in the city, but for now the rats were running across the floor and tables every night. Plague will go away. He stood in the basement of the warehouse and looked at rat burrows, dozens holes in stone walls, droppings everywhere, traces teeth on the bags of grain. Next to stood Hans. The boy wasn't afraid of rats. He said that in barracks they were running over the sleeping. Kyle asked Erica what she knows about roaches. Erica said something that everyone. The rats spread disease. That was common knowledge. Even doctors of these knew. But no one did know how. Everyone thought that the rats poison the air. Miasms. Kyle knew the truth. Fleas. Fleas bite the rat. They get infected. The rat dies. The fleas move. Per person. They bite. They infect. A person dies. A chain reaction. Break any link and the plague will slow down. It's impossible to kill all the rats, but we can cut them off from people. Kyle came up with a plan. Line the grain silos with sheet metal at the bottom. The rats won't gnaw through it. Fill the basements with lime. Block the rat holes with stone and pour in an alkaline solution. Clear the trash from the streets. Don't throw food scraps at the doorstep. Carry them to special pits behind the wall. Cut off the rats' food and shelter. They'll leave on their own. Not all of them. But there will be fewer, far fewer. The Duke listened to the plan and nodded. He assigned 20 workers. Kyle commanded them for a week. He went through the basements. He climbed around the warehouses. He was covered in lime from head to toe. Martha saw him in the evening and said he looked like a ghost, white from head to toe. Kyle didn't laugh. He was too tired. The results appeared after 2 weeks. There were noticeably fewer rats on the streets. The townspeople saw it. They commented on it. One old man said that for the first time in a year, he hadn't heard the gnawing in the walls at night. Kyle wrote that down, not as a statistic, as a small victory. But while he was fighting the rats, something else happened. Mueller was making his move. Kyle found out about it from Sebastian. The monk came by in the evening, pale. He said he'd overheard a conversation at the monastery. Archbishop Ferdinand and the merchant Mueller had been meeting, secretly, in the monastery library. Sebastian was cleaning in the next room. The door wasn't closed tightly. He didn't hear everything, but enough. Mueller was offering money, a lot of money, for the restoration of the cathedral, for new stained glass windows, for a bell. In exchange, he asked for one thing: that the archbishop officially condemn soap as an instrument of heresy, publicly, with a sermon, with a church verdict. Ferdinand didn't agree right away, but he didn't refuse either. He said he'd think about it. Kyle listened and grew cold. The archbishop and the merchant, the church and money. If Ferdinand declared soap heresy, half the city would stop using it. Not because they didn't believe it worked, but because they fear hell more than the plague. And those who continue to use it will become heretics, and heretics are burned in this world. Kyle went to the Duke. He told him. The Duke listened in silence. Then he stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city for a long time, at the smoke from the soap factories, at the boiling house in the square, at the people washing their hands by the barrels. He said he couldn't order the archbishop. The church doesn't answer to the Duke. It has its own laws, its own court, its own rules. If Ferdinand decides to declare soap a heresy, the Duke can protect Kyle physically. He can keep a guard between him and the church officials. But he cannot overturn a church verdict. That is beyond his authority. Kyle asked what he could do. The Duke turned. He said there was one thing. The Nordheim Cathedral is under the archbishop's authority, but parish churches are under the authority of parish priests. If the parish priests support soap, if at least half of them say that washing is not a sin, Ferdinand won't be able to declare heresy what his own priests support. He'll be ridiculed. The flock will leave. Kyle understood. He needs priests, not the archbishop. Ordinary priests. Those who stand before the people every Sunday. Those who see children dying in their parishes. Sebastian said he would help. That he knew a few young monks who were having doubts, who had seen the numbers and couldn't ignore them. Kyle asked him to arrange a meeting, a quiet one, without fanfare. 3 days later, Kyle was standing in the monastery basement. 7 people sat before him. 4 monks, 3 parish priests, all young, all frightened. They came because Sebastian asked them to, because they trusted him. Kyle spoke for an hour. No fancy words, no science, just facts, numbers. How many people died before the soap? How many after? Which neighborhoods wash their hands? Which ones don't? Where children die? Where they survive? He didn't ask them to renounce their faith. Didn't ask them to admit that God had nothing to do with it. He said something else. He said that God gave people ash and fat, gave them hands to mix them, gave them minds to understand. Maybe soap isn't heresy. Maybe soap is a gift from God, like bread, like wine, like fire. Silence. The priests exchanged glances. One coughed. Another rubbed his forehead. A third, a young man of about 22, stood up and said that in his parish 32 children had died in 6 months, and that since Hans had brought the soap, not a single one had died in the last month. Not a single one. He said he couldn't look the mothers in the eye and tell them that washing their hands was a sin. 2 others nodded. Not all of them. 2 out of 7 remained silent, but 5 nodded. 5 priests out of 7. That was more than Kyle had hoped for. They left that night, one by one, so no one would see. But each of the 5 promised one thing. Next Sunday, they wouldn't say that washing was a sin. Some might say that washing one's hands was permissible, a small step, but a step in the right direction. Kyle stepped out of the basement into the night. Cold air, stars above the rooftops, the smell of smoke. Sebastian walked beside him. He was silent. Then he said it was dangerous. What if Ferdinand found out? Kyle said he knew. Sebastian nodded. They walked in silence through the dark streets. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Kyle thought about Sunday, about the 5 priests, about the thousands of people who would hear their words, and maybe wash their hands. Sunday changed everything. 5 priests in 5 parishes in Nordheim said that washing is a sin. 3 of them went further. One said that purity of the faith helps the purity of the soul. Another said that caring for health means to value God's companies from God. The third, most brave, said straight that soap saves lives and that God could want for children die from filth. Kyle was present. He was at Soap Factory. Hans ran between churches and retold, gasping for breath, muddling words, but the meaning was clear. The wall cracked. It collapsed, but it cracked. Ferdinand's was swift. The day the Archbishop convened a meeting of the clergy, 22 priests and monks of Nordheim. Kyle didn't know what was behind the doors. Sebastian, too. It's too dangerous to eavesdrop. But the result became known by evening. The Archbishop issued a proclamation. Washing one's hands is permissible for health reasons, but washing the body for the sake of adornment and vanity remains a sin. Soap is not heresy, but anyone who claims that soap replaces prayer is a heretic. Kyle read the proclamation 3 times. It was a compromise. Ferdinand backed down. He did not give in. He backed down. He allowed soap, but set a condition. Soap works, but God works too. Soap heals the body. Prayer heals the soul. One without the other is incomplete. For Kyle, it was a victory. Not a complete one, but a real one. The church no longer said that washing was a sin. Mothers were no longer afraid to wash their children's hands. Moritz's parish in the southern district doubled its soap consumption within a week of the message. Moritz himself hadn't changed, but he fell silent. He stopped saying that soap was unclean. In this case, silence spoke louder than words. Mueller lost this round. His money didn't help. The Archbishop accepted his proposal, but twisted it to his own advantage. He did not condemn soap. He found a third way. Kyle thought Mueller would back down. He was wrong. In the 6th month, what Kyle had been waiting for since day 1 happened. The boiling house in the square had been operating for 3 months. 3 soap factories were making soap daily. The septic tanks behind the wall received the sewage. There were fewer rats, and for the first time in a year, the infant mortality rate in Nordheim fell below the level it had been at before the plague. Not from the plague. At all. Children stopped dying from diarrhea, from fever, from festering wounds. Boiled water and soap killed more than just the plague. They killed dozens of diseases that were considered normal here. Kyle wrote down the figure. A 60% drop in infant mortality. He stood by the blackboard in the soap factory and stared at that number. 60%. That meant that for every 10 children who used to die, now only 4 died. 6 remained alive. 6 children out of every 10. He didn't know how many that was in absolute numbers. Dozens, maybe hundreds, each with their own name, with their own eyes, with their own laughter. The news spread through the city quickly, not through a decree, through the mothers. Women told each other. A neighbor's child had survived, even though he'd been sick. She washed his hands, she gave him boiled water, and he survived. That was stronger than any decree, stronger than a sermon. A mother who sees that her child is alive because she washed his hands will not listen to any doctor or priest who tells her not to wash them. Kyle realized he had reached a turning point, not from above, not through authority, but from below, through mothers, through children, through living children who, not long ago, would have been dead. They began to call him by a different name. First, the soap maker, Then, the soap heretic. Now, he heard another word. The soap saint. Kyle didn't want that. Absolutely not. A saint is dangerous. A saint is a target for the church, for envy, for madmen. But it was impossible to stop it. The word took on a life of its own. By the middle of the 6th month, the sewer work yielded its first results. The septic tanks behind the wall were working. Sewage no longer flowed directly into the river. Kyle added another line. A stone gutter from the central quarter to the wall. Simple, open, sloped. Sewage flowed down the gutter into the septic tank. Not perfect. The stench was still there. But the river had become cleaner. The fishermen were the first to notice. They said the fish had returned to the docks. They'd left before. The water had been too dirty. Now they were coming back. A small sign, but Kyle took note of it. The city began to smell different. Not good. It was far from good. But the smoke from the soap factories mingled with the smell of lime and fresh shavings from the new gutters, and that smell was the smell of life, not death. People started smiling at the market. Kyle noticed it one morning. An apple vendor smiled at a customer. She just smiled, because it was a sunny morning and children were running around the square and no one was coughing. He stood there and watched that smile, and he thought that for that one smile alone, it was worth dying from shawarma and waking up in a cart full of corpses. But Mueller wasn't smiling. Mueller was taking action. In the 24th week, Hans ran over again. He'd seen a ship in the harbor. At night. No flags, no lights. It was being unloaded at the far pier. There were no guards there. Kyle went with Hans, found the pier. Empty. But there were traces on the planks. Dirt. Straw from the barrels. Drops of something dark. Kyle crouched down and sniffed. Vinegar. No, not vinegar. Something else. He dipped his finger in and rubbed it. Oily. Sticky. With a faint smell of sulfur. Kyle froze. The smell of sulfur. Chemicals. Not natural. Someone had brought something in. At night. Secretly. Without inspection. He stood up and looked around. The far pier. Behind Mueller's warehouses. Mueller. His warehouses. His piers. His ships. Kyle stood in the darkness and sensed that something was happening beneath the surface that he didn't yet understand. Something connected to the ship without flags and the oily trail with the smell of sulfur. He took a rag, collected a sample, hid it in his pocket. He'd show it to Erica in the morning. Maybe she'd figure out what it was. Hans stood nearby and said nothing. He'd learned to be quiet when Kyle was thinking. They walked back through the dark streets. Kyle counted his steps and thought that the plague in Nordheim might not be a coincidence, that the port was too conveniently located, that the neighboring duchy was too interested, and that the ship without flags at Mueller's pier at night might be the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. Erica sniffed the rag and recoiled. She said that she knew this smell. 20 years ago, after the siege Feldmark, she saw how the alchemist of the Dark of Grainhaven prepare potions. Poisonous fumes for siege machines, sulfur mixtures. It then treated the wounded and remembered the smell. Oily, with bitter, with a hint ash. It was a mixture that alchemists called black water. Kyle asked what it is. Erica said that exactly doesn't knows, but some who worked with black water got sick. They were covered with sores. They died. Kyle stood and thought. Black water. Sulfuric composition. The ship without flags at the pier. The caravan from Grainhaven which brought the disease via goods, and most importantly, plague in Nordheim began suddenly. It comes slowly from the villages. It spread from the port like an epidemic. It struck all at once. Thousands of people for the first 2 weeks, as if someone had a faucet. Kyle went to Sebastian. He asked him to check the monastery chronicles. When exactly the plague? Where did the first patient? Sebastian left the library and returned after 3 hours. with parchment. The chronicles recorded the first case, the plague in Nordheim 7 months ago. 2 days earlier, a caravan from Grainhaven had arrived at the port, a merchant caravan, grain and spices. The chronicles noted that the caravan was unusually cheap. The grain was sold below cost. The entire market was flooded with it in a single day. Every family in town bought grain from that caravan, and 2 days later, they started getting sick. Kyle sat down on a bench and stared at the wall. Contaminated grain, sold cheap so everyone would buy it. They spread the infection throughout the city in one fell swoop. This isn't a random epidemic, it's an attack, a biological weapon, primitive, medieval, but effective. Grainhaven wanted the port of Nordheim, the most convenient port on the coast, a deep harbor, a sheltered bay. If Nordheim dies out, the port can be taken. No siege, no war, no casualties. The plague will do the army's work. Kyle told the Duke. Everything. The chronicles, the caravan, cheap grain, a ship without flags, black water. The Duke listened, and his face changed. First, disbelief, then doubt, then something dark and dangerous. He summoned the captain of the guard, ordered him to find those who had bought the grain 7 months ago, who the caravan went through, who led it through, who traded. The captain left. Kyle waited. 2 days later, the captain brought the answer. The caravan came through the south gate. A guard named Dieter led it through. Dieter disappeared a month ago. No one looked for him. In a plague-ridden city, people vanish every day. The caravan belonged to a trading house. The trading house belonged to Mueller's partner in Grainhaven. Kyle wasn't surprised. Mueller. Mueller again. The merchant who shouted that the quarantine was killing trade, who met with the archbishop, who wanted to get rid of Kyle. Mueller worked for Grainhaven, or with Grainhaven. He was selling out his city for money. The Duke wanted to arrest him immediately. Kyle stopped him, said there wasn't enough evidence. A missing guard, a business partner, a ship without flags, all of it circumstantial. Mueller is rich. He has connections, lawyers, merchants who will take his side. We need more. The Duke slammed his fist on the table. He asked what Kyle was proposing. Kyle proposed a trap. If Mueller is connected to Grainhaven, then he's passing on information about the state of the city, about the quarantine, about whether the plague is active. We need to feed him false information and see how Grainhaven reacts. The Duke agreed. Through his advisor, he spread the rumor that the quarantine had been lifted, that the Duke was tired of the soapmaker and his fabrications, that the port was open for free trade. The rumor was spread carefully, through people close to Mueller's circle. Kyle waited. A week later, 3 ships from Grainhaven entered the port of Nordheim, without warning, without the usual trade papers. They sailed in as if to their own port. Guards at the pier stopped them, forced them to undergo inspection. The ship captains were surprised. They were told the quarantine had been lifted. Who said so? They didn't answer, but one of the sailors was carrying a small barrel in a sack, sealed with wax. The guards opened it. Inside was grain, soaked in an oily liquid with the smell of sulfur. Kyle stood on the pier and looked at the barrel. There it was, the proof. Fresh, infected grain, ready to be sold at the market. A new batch of plague for Nordheim. The Duke ordered the sailors arrested, the ship captains, and Mueller. They took Mueller at night, in his own home. He was asleep. The guards carried him out in his nightshirt. Kyle saw his face by the light of the torches. Fear, real fear, for the first time. The interrogation lasted 2 days. Mueller remained silent the first day. On the second, he spoke. He admitted that he had received money from the Duke of Grainhaven, that he had let caravans pass without inspection, that he knew about the contaminated grain, that he didn't care. The port of Nordheim was supposed to pass to Grainhaven. Mueller would have gained a trade monopoly. Money. Power. Who cares how many people die? Kyle stood by the wall of the interrogation room and listened. He was shaking. Not from the cold, from rage. 4,000 people. Dead. Burned behind the wall. Children, old people, mothers, husbands. None of them died from God's wrath. Not from fate. From one man's greed and another's calculation. He walked out of the interrogation room and stood on the porch, breathing, deeply, longly. Hans approached. He stood silently beside him. Kyle looked at him. A boy whose parents had died of the plague brought in a barrel of grain. Hans didn't know that yet. Kyle didn't say anything. Not now. The Duke had ordered Mueller to be hanged, in public, in the market square. But first, his crime had to be announced. The town crier read aloud to the crowd. Merchant Gustav Mueller, in collusion with the Duchy of Greinhofen, had poisoned the grain and brought the plague to Nordheim. 4,000 residents were dead because of him. The square fell silent. Then it erupted in noise. Someone began to cry. Someone screamed. One man rushed toward the gallows and was barely restrained by the guards. His wife and 2 children had died in the first month. Mueller was hanged in complete silence. No one applauded. No one rejoiced. The traitor's death would not bring back 4,000 lives. Kyle stood in the crowd and didn't look. He was looking at the ships in the harbor. 3 ships from Grainhaven were under arrest. Their crews were in prison. But Grainhaven was still there, beyond the horizon, with the alchemist, with the Duke who wants this port. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. After execution of the city changed. Not right away, but profoundly. People learned that the plague was not a punishment, but human meanness. This turned everything. Those who prayed and endured now wanted to act. They who rejected soap because that believed in God's will now stood in lines at barrels with soap solution. If the plague the hands human then, and fight against it we human means. The logic is simple, and terrifying for the church. Archbishop Ferdinand realized this before others. Kyle saw how he stood on steps of the cathedral in the day of and watched at the crowd. His face was stony. His eyes were unmoving. He didn't say a word. But Kyle knew that a mechanism was at work inside that head. Fast. Ruthless. Ferdinand was no fool. He was dangerous precisely because he wasn't a fool. Kyle wasn't expecting a blow. He was busy with the city. In the 7th month, real sewer work began. The Duke had found the money. He'd confiscated Mueller's property, houses, warehouses, ships, gold. It all went into the treasury, and for the first time in a year, the treasury was full. Kyle presented the Duke with a plan for the Central District's sewer system. Stone gutters beneath the streets, sloping toward the wall, leading to septic tanks, sealed, so rats couldn't get in, so the smell wouldn't rise. It wasn't a 21st century project. Kyle didn't remember the details of modern sewer systems, but he remembered the principle. Waste flows down, away from people, away from water, using gravity. The masons worked every day, 30 men, digging, laying stone, filling the joints with lime mortar. Kyle checked the slope, tilted a board, poured water, watched where it flowed. If it didn't go where it should, they redid it. Martha commanded the women who prepared food for the workers. Hans carried water. Sebastian recorded the progress of the work. Erica treated bruises and cuts. A small army, without swords, with shovels and soap. By the end of the 7th month, the Central District was connected. The first flush. Kyle stood at the sewer outlet behind the wall and watched as the sewage flowed into the settling tank instead of the river. The workers stood nearby, watching. One said he never thought he'd be happy watching sewage flow by. Martha laughed. Kyle did too, for the first time in a long time. The smell in the Central District had changed over the course of a week. It hadn't disappeared, But it had become different, lighter, cleaner. The residents noticed. They commented. One old woman said that for the first time in a year, she could open her window. Hans told Kyle, and Kyle wrote it on the board. Not as a number, as a little story. An open window. By the 8th month, Kyle began to think about the future. Not about next week, about next year. About the time when the plague would be gone. Because it was going away. Slowly. But it was going away. New cases were becoming fewer. 5 a week. 3. 2. Not 0. But the trend was clear. Soap and boiling and quarantine and sewage and rat control were doing their job. Every link in the chain was working. Together, they were suffocating the plague. Kyle thought about the soap factories. 3 is not enough for the future. When the plague is gone, people will forget. They'll stop washing their hands. They'll stop boiling water. They'll go back to the old ways. Because people tend to forget. We need a system. One that doesn't depend on a single person. Not on Kyle. Not on the Duke. A system that will run on its own. He wrote a document, in charcoal on parchment. Sebastian copied it out beautifully. The Nordheim Soapworks Charter. It contained rules. Soap is produced constantly, not just during the plague. Soap is distributed for free in the poor neighborhoods. In the wealthy ones, it is sold for a nominal price. The revenue goes toward maintaining the soapworks. The boiling houses operate year-round. The sewer system is maintained and expanded. Every new house is built with drainage in mind. Once a month, every parish priest speaks about clean hands, not as a religious duty, but as common sense. The Duke read the charter, at length. Then he looked at Kyle. He asked why he needed this. Kyle didn't understand the question. The Duke clarified. He asked what Kyle wanted for himself. A title, land, money, a position. Kyle thought. Then he said he wanted one thing. For washing hands to become as natural as closing a door. For not a single child in Nordheim to die from filth. Never. The Duke looked at him. For a long minute. Then he signed the charter. The Duke's seal was stamped on the parchment. Sebastian made 10 copies. He took one to the monastery. The abbot read it. He said nothing, but he hung a copy in the refectory, next to the fasting rules. In the 9th month, Kyle ran into Richter, by chance, on the street. Richter was walking alone, without a mask, without an entourage, thin, aged. Kyle stopped. Richter did too. They stood facing each other. Richter spoke first. He said the guild was falling apart. The healers were leaving. Some had come to Kyle and asked to be taught. Others had left the city. Still others had drunk themselves to death. The guild that had controlled Nordheim's medicine for centuries had ceased to exist. Kyle remained silent. Richter asked if he was satisfied. Kyle said no, that he didn't need to destroy the guild. He needed people to stop dying from filth. If the guild had accepted soap from day one, they would have worked together. Richter smiled, bitterly. He said that Kyle didn't understand, that soap wasn't just a remedy. Soap was the end of the world Richter lived in, a world where the healer was the intermediary between life and death, where knowledge belonged to the few, where healing was paid for because it was a secret, and Kyle had made healing accessible to all, free, as simple as a piece of fat and a handful of ash. This isn't medicine, it's a revolution. Kyle looked at the old healer. Then he said he was right. It is a revolution, and it will not stop. Richter nodded, turned around and walked away. Kyle watched him go. He felt no anger. He felt no triumph. Only the emptiness and weariness of a man who had shattered someone else's world and built a new one in its place. On 10th month A from Grainhaven, an official one, with the age of the edge of Greinhaufen, addressed Duke Charles von Braunwald. Kyle stood beside when the Duke opened it. Carl read in silence. His did change. Then he put the letter on the dead and turned toward Cale. Duke of Grainhaven denied everything. He wrote that Mueller had acted on his own, that Grainhaven had nothing to do with the contaminated grain, that the accusations were groundless, and that if Nordheim continued to detain Grainhaven ships, it would be considered an act of war. Kyle read the letter twice. A classic denial. Denying everything while making threats at the same time. Duke Carl asked what Kyle thought. Kyle said that Grainhaven was bluffing. War requires an army. An army costs money. If Grainhaven had the money for war, they wouldn't be contaminating grain. Plague is the weapon of the poor, of those who can't afford a siege. The Duke nodded. But he said that bluff or not, the threat had to be neutralized. He wrote a reply. Dry. Official. It contained facts. Mueller's testimony. Contaminated grain from the ships. The sailors' names. And one demand. If Duke Greinhofen wanted peace, let him hand over his alchemist, the one who prepared the black water. The reply left with the messenger. Kyle didn't expect Greinhofen to agree, but the pressure was necessary. While diplomacy was underway, Kyle was busy with other things. He was teaching people, not just soap making, everything he knew. Boiling, disinfection, quarantine, wound care, basic hygiene. He gathered groups of 20 people in the soap factory and spoke for 2 hours, in simple language, without jargon. He demonstrated with examples. Here's a dirty hand. Here's a clean one. Here's a wound washed with distilled water. Here's a wound without washing. See for yourselves. People listened. They nodded. They asked questions. One woman asked why they hadn't been taught this before. Kyle didn't know what to say. Because it was too simple. Because simple answers don't make money. Because if washing your hands saves lives, why pay a doctor? He didn't say that. He said they were teaching it now, and that was what mattered. Sebastian transcribed every lecture, every recipe, every instruction, parchment after parchment. The stack in the monastery library grew. Kyle asked him why so many copies. Sebastian replied that the monasteries were connected, that he could send copies to 20 monasteries along the coast. Kyle paused. He looked at the monk. 20 monasteries, 20 cities. If every monastery started making soap and teaching people, if even half of them did, that wasn't hundreds saved. That was thousands, tens of thousands. Kyle sat down on a bench. His legs went weak, not from fatigue, from the scale of it all. He thought of Nordheim, of 8,000, and Sebastian thought of the coast, of hundreds of thousands. The monk in the cassock with ink-stained fingers saw further than the former bartender from Edinburgh. Kyle told him to do it, to send copies, to all the monasteries, with detailed instructions, with drawings, with numbers. Let each abbot decide for himself, but let him have a choice. Sebastian nodded. His eyes were burning. He went into the monastery and didn't come out for 3 days. He wrote. He copied. He drew diagrams of soap making, distillation diagrams, boiling diagrams. Every sheet was neat, precise, beautiful. The monastery's calligraphy school had come in handy for saving lives. In the 11th month, a miracle happened in Nordheim. Not a religious one, a statistical one. For an entire week, not a single person died of the plague. Not one. For the first time in a year. Kyle stood at the blackboard in the soap factory and looked at the column. 0. 0 deaths. Martha stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said quietly that she didn't believe it. Kyle said he didn't either. But numbers don't lie. 0 is 0. The Duke came to the soap factory when he found out. He stood by the board. He looked at the 0. Then he turned to Kyle. He didn't say anything. He just held out his hand. Kyle shook it. The Duke's hand was firm and warm. The hand of a man who had lost 2 daughters and an entire city, and who had found a madman with a bar of soap and believed him. But 0 didn't mean victory. Kyle knew that. The plague could return. The rats hadn't disappeared. The fleas hadn't disappeared. The bacteria hadn't disappeared. They were lying in wait, waiting for the moment. All it would take was one dirty well, one infected ship, one unwashed piece of bread, and it would all start over again. Kyle called a meeting. The Duke, Martha, Sebastian, Erica, Hans, the captain of the guard, the advisor, everyone in one room. Kyle spoke for an hour about what needed to be done next. The soap factories must operate forever. The boiling pits must operate forever. The sewer system must be expanded. Every neighborhood, every street. Rats must be exterminated constantly. The port must inspect every ship, every caravan, forever. This isn't a temporary measure. This is the new order. This is how Nordheim lives now. The Duke listened, nodded, then said he agreed with everything except one thing. Kyle asked what he disagreed with. The Duke said that Kyle hadn't named himself, that his plan includes soap factories and boiling houses and the sewer system, but not Kyle. Who would keep watch? Who would make the decisions? Who would fight when a new Richter or a new Mueller appeared? Kyle was silent. The Duke said he wanted to appoint him city health inspector, a position that hadn't existed before, a new one, for a new world. Kyle looked at Hans. The boy was sitting on the edge of his chair, swinging his legs. Nordheim's youngest health inspector. Kyle said he agreed, but on one condition. Hans would be his assistant, officially, with a salary. The Duke looked at the boy. Hans sat up straight. The Duke nodded. 1 year, 365 days with that morning when Kyle opened his eyes in the cart with the corpses. He stood on the fortress wall and looked down at the city. Nordheim was breathing below. The market was full. The shops were open. Children were running across the square. Dogs were barking. Smoke rose in steady columns from the chimneys. Not the black smoke from the bonfires beyond the wall. Ordinary smoke from stoves and hearths. The smoke of life. Over the past year, the city had lost 4,000 people. Of the 12,000, just over 8,000 remained. But 8,000 were alive, healthy. They washed their hands. They drank boiled water. They carried waste to the sewers, not into the river. They cleaned up the trash. They sealed up rat holes. They bought soap, or got it for free. 3 soap factories were in operation, 600 bars a day. Martha managed 12 workers. She had become a different person over the past year. From a simple laundress, she had turned into a master. Kyle saw how she taught the new recruits, patiently, strictly, with the same fire in her eyes she'd had on her first day. Her hands were still red, but now she wore gloves Kyle had made from oiled cloth. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Erica took on 12 apprentices, former guild doctors, those who came and asked to be taught. She taught them to clean wounds, to boil instruments, to wash their hands before examining a patient. They learned, slowly, with difficulty. 20 years of bad habits aren't erased in a month, but they learned. One of them, an old man named Fritz, said that in 40 years of practice, not a single patient had survived after an abscess was lanced. And now 9 out of 10 survive, because he washes his hands. He just washes his hands. Fritz said this and fell silent. And in his silence lay everything. Shame, understanding, bitterness for the thousands of patients he had killed with his dirty hands, without knowing, without meaning harm, just not knowing. Sebastian sent letters to 18 monasteries. Replies came from 12. 8 wrote that they had started making soap, 3 that they had started boiling water, 1 that had built a boiling house in the town square based on Sebastian's blueprints. Little lights along the coast, each in its own town, each on its own. But together they formed a line of purity, from monastery to monastery. Kyle read the letters and felt something strange. Hope, real hope. Not the desperate grasping at straws that had been there in the early days, but a real, quiet confidence that the world could become cleaner. Anna came to the soap kitchen every day. She was 7. She had learned to mix soap properly, not just 2 batches like the first time, but a full batch. Martha grumbled that a girl had no place by the cauldrons. Kyle said that it was precisely girls like her who should grow up by the cauldrons, so that for the next generation, soap would be not a miracle, but an everyday thing. The Duke came every evening, not to inspect, just to sit. He would sit on the bench next to Kyle and say nothing. Sometimes they talked, about the city, about trade, about the future. The Duke told him about his 2 older daughters. Margarita, 10 years old, loved horses. Eliza, 8, drew flowers on the palace walls. Both died in the first month, before Kyle, before the soap, before everything. The Duke spoke of them in an even voice, without tears. The tears had long since dried up. Only his voice grew quieter. Kyle listened. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say everything would be all right. He just listened. Because sometimes that's all that's needed. In the 12th month, a reply arrived from Grainhaven. Not a letter, a man, an alchemist. They brought him in chains. 2 guards accompanied him. With them was a letter from the Duke of Grainhaven, a short one. It said that the alchemist had acted on his own initiative, that the Duke of Grainhaven had not known about the contaminated grain, that the alchemist's surrender was a gesture of goodwill. Lies, every word a lie, but lies with the right result. Greinhofen was afraid. 18 monasteries along the coast knew what had happened in Nordheim. They knew about the contaminated grain. They knew Greinhofen's name. If Grainhaven hadn't backed down, the monasteries might have raised a fuss. And the monasteries are the church. And in this world, you don't go to war with the church. The alchemist was interrogated. A small man, nervous, with scorched fingers and darting eyes. He told them everything, how he prepared the mixture, from plague buboes, dried, ground, mixed with sulfur and fat. It turned into an oily liquid, black water. They soaked the grain in it. They sold the grain. People ate it. People died. Simple, effective, monstrous. Kyle listened and thought back to school. Biological weapons, the 21st century, the Convention on Prohibition, international law. And here, a little alchemist with scorched fingers calmly recounts how he ground plague buboes in a mortar. The alchemist was hanged, quietly, no square, no crowd. Kyle didn't go. He sat in the soap factory and watched the fire. Hans sat next to him. They were both silent. Then Hans asked if it was all over. Kyle said the plague was almost over. Hans asked what wasn't over. Kyle said the struggle to get people to wash their hands would never end, that every generation would forget, and every generation someone would have to remind them. Hans thought for a moment. Then he said he would remind them. Kyle looked at him. The boy was 11, an orphan. He had survived the plague. He had survived the barracks. He carried soap through the neighborhoods. He saw the mercenary and saved Kyle's life. If anyone was going to remind them, it would be this boy. Kyle nodded. He said he believed him. Archbishop Ferdinand struck a blow on 12th month. Then, when Kyle thought that it was over, when the plague had receded, when the city breathed a sigh of relief, when it seemed that it was just live. In the morning at the doors of the cathedral, a notice: Kyle from Nordheim is accused of heresy. He treats without prayer, uses the power of unknown origin, teaches people that disease can be without God's help. Judgment in the square. Through 3 days. Kyle found out from Hans. The boy ran pale, gasping for breath. Kyle listened and sat on the bench. 3 days. Ferdinand waited a whole year. He had been waiting the moment, and chose perfectly. Chuma defeated. Kyle no longer is needed for survival of the city. One can judge, you can condemn, you can remove, and return the old order. The church heals the soul. Doctors treat the body. Soap to forget how a nightmare. Kyle went to the Duke. Carl was pale. He said that he knew, that he tried to stop it. But the church did not secular court. The Duke does have the right to him. He may only be present. He can speak and defend, but passes is by the Archbishop. Kyle asked what options. The Duke said two: run or stay. Kyle asked what would it if he ran. The Duke said that soap factories would be closed. The charter will be repealed. Sebastian will be accused of aiding and abetting. Eric, too. Everything that has been over the year will crumble. Kyle asked what would it if stand.